The investigation was led by Chief Inspector Drew of the CID, who had overseen the murders of French Fifi, Marie Cotton, Dutch Leia and Red Max, and would confirm this is a case of murder. As before, there was no struggle, robbery or assault. With a timeline of events as clear as the day itself, the evidence as irrefutable as dust, and an embarrassment of eyewitnesses who had seen and spoken to her killer, face to face from just a few inches away, there was no mystery as to who had murdered her. A composite description was compiled by the witnesses. He was aged 24 to 30, 5'3" to 5'4", thin to medium build, a roundish pasty face, a ruddy complexion, blue eyes, brown brushback hair, a dark brownish scruffy suit, and no hat. That same man was seen with the victim at the Adam and Eve pub, at Seaton Place Market, and then at 4 p.m. Both were seen by the tenants of the building, entering her second floor flat at 306 Euston Road. Dr. Alexander Burney confirmed by in situ examination that her time of death was 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eva and Kaufmann Schladever, living one floor above, saw that same man from their window walk into Bath Row and into Euston Road at roughly 5:30 p.m. And no one was seen to enter or exit her room until at 6 p.m, as established by the scent factory whistle, when they extinguished the fire and found Marie. With the police report stating, there is no doubt that the murderer was a chance pickup in a public house. The evidence was irrefutable. Her killer was a man she trusted, having held his hand on the walk back, accepted a kiss in public, and let him into her flat for sex, when it could have occurred in any of the nearby back alleys. Inside, they sang and clapped to the music, as heard by Eva. They drank 4 bottles of stout, 2 of Reed's and 2 of Guinness, which were marked with that day's date and the pub's address. And then at the table, they both enjoyed a light meal, with the man opening the salmon tin with a can opener. Sex followed, as she willingly removed her hat, bra and knickers, but not her dress. She lay on the bed, her back on the sheets, her head on the pillow, and with no signs of a struggle, no cuts, no internal bruising, and no fingernails broken. Consensual vaginal sex is believed to have taken place. Only this time, something would change. With a fist to the face, a lack of struggle suggested she'd been knocked out. With frothy mucus in her airway and bruising about her neck, she was manually strangled at first, but then with a ligature, later taken by the killer. It is unknown if it was knotted, or if he held it tight until her life had ebbed away. The police would state, "We failed to find anything in the nature of a ligature." With Marie not wearing any stockings, either he had taken it as a souvenir, kept it as it belonged to him, or it was destroyed in a short ferocious fire, which blackened the sink burnt the curtain, and turned the rags within to cinders. With no money in her purse, it's possible that this trusted punter didn't need to pay for the sex first. But with the witnesses stating he had no more than £50 in his hand, what was his plan? His motive was a mystery. But given enough time, his identity would not. Although unknown to pub locals and West End coppers, with his fingerprints on the can opener, the bottles, the salmon tin and her handbag, the police would manually search every fingerprint of every criminal with a history of assaulting women or prostitutes who matched that man's description. It was an almost impossible task, made simpler as he had left a few clues. Openly chatting in the pub to two strangers, Frederick Dobson and George Bakewell, Marie's killer had shared details about his life. In coordination with the Durham police, they searched for a short, thinly built, mid-20s man with a round, pasty face who was born or raised in Newcastle. But as he mentioned nowhere specific, their list was too long. The same was said of every coal mine they checked in both Wales and the North East. A more specific lead was that he was once a boxer. His last fight was with a man named Maguire, who had ruined him. But having interviewed over 1,000 boxers, working with the British Boxing Board, the Amateur Boxing Association, and having posted an article in Boxing magazine, no one could recall Maguire or his opponent. Having said he was unemployed, the police checked the details of every man who had recently signed on at the Labour Exchange. Having said he was homeless, they searched every lodging house, hotel and casual ward in London and Newcastle. And having said that he'd been sacked that morning from the Central Hotel in Marylebone for upsetting a milk churn, they questioned the hotel staff, the agency and the Ministry of Work, but came up with no one. The police placed informants in public areas. Witnesses compared photographs of possible suspects at the records office. And as they had done with Fifi, Marie and Leah, they requested that every police division in the country compile a list of men with convictions for assaulting women who matched that description. Every suspect was questioned and investigated. But with solid alibis, they were all released. They had evidence, fingerprints, and eyewitnesses. And yet, even after weeks of dogged investigation, with every avenue of suspicion examined, and any possible suspect scrutinized, the case had begun to stall. The police report states, "The inquiry has been aggravating. For whilst we have witnesses together with fingerprints to support a conviction, we have no prisoner. We have many witnesses capable of identifying him, but up to the moment, he is unknown. However, no effort is being spared to bring this to a successful termination, and DCI Drew and his officers are in no way disheartened. I am hoping for a little good fortune to come their way, which has been conspicuously absent so far." Once again, a strangler had vanished into thin air. Only he wasn't a criminal mastermind or a crazed sadistic genius. He was just an ordinary man, living in a population of 47 million people, in an era where the best resource the police had was a card index. For him, it wasn't difficult to disappear when the police didn't know who he was. His name was Norman Stephenson. Born on the 10th of March 1913, 300 miles north of London, in the northeast city of Newcastle, Norman was always an undersized boy, often bullied for being small, and whose weedy frame, ruddy cheeks and pale face contrasted starkly with his dark brushback hair. It always made him look sickly and weak. But maybe that's why he lied about being a miner, a boxer, and why he regularly visited prostitutes. As deep down, he was just a little boy who wanted to be seen as a man. Little is known about his upbringing. Just a small walk from Castle Leazes Moor and Fenham Barracks. But being jolly and chatty to all, he blended in because he didn't stick out. Educated at St Andrew's Council School, age 14, he left being described as educated but not smart, and being too small for heavy labour. His first job in 1927 was as an errand boy for a picture framer. But all that changed when a little mistake left him scarred for life. On the 14th of September 1927, Norman's favourite football team, Newcastle FC, were playing against Derby County at St James's Park. Being too poor to buy a ticket, this little whippersnapper had tried to sneak in by shimmying up the 6-foot-high railings. When he slipped, with 2 iron spikes impaled through his stomach, all he could do was hang there, in pain, as blood ran from his midriff down to his feet and his face. Hospitalized for 3 weeks, he would be plagued with bouts of sickness and unemployment for life. After his accident, his work record became sporadic. In 1928, he was a confectioner's van boy, but quit in 1930 owing to stomach pains. In early 1931, he was off sick, but worked for 9 months erecting a concrete garage in Newcastle. And in April 1932, he worked at Park Royal Training in West London. But owing to sickness, he returned to Newcastle, where he engaged in casual work and petty crime to fund his habitual drinking and sex with prostitutes. Norman Stephenson had 10 convictions, mostly for minor offences. On the 27th of February 1931 and the 8th of February 1932 in Gateshead, he was charged with acting suspiciously. 11th of January 1933, he did 6 months in prison for stealing cigarettes. 22nd of January 1934 at Newcastle, he was fined for stealing 2 tins of petrol. And on the 14th of May 1934, he did 3 months hard labour for stealing women's clothes. Upon his release, in February 1935, he moved to London, and as may have been misheard, or possibly it was a little white lie to sound tough. For 6 months, he was a boiler house labourer at the Central Hotel on the Marylebone Road. Only he wasn't sacked for upsetting a milk churn, but left owing to ill health. On the 9th of October 1935, at Marylebone Police Court, he was sentenced to 2 months hard labour for stealing from a gas meter. On the 16th of June 1936, back in Newcastle, he served 9 months for shop breaking, and again for stealing from a gas meter. And on the 31st of May 1937, in Willesden, West London, he would serve another 3 months hard labour at Wandsworth Prison for stealing 12 shillings, again from a gas meter. As a weak and sickly boy, little Norman Stephenson didn't fit the profile of a murderer. He was a part-time labourer who suffered with stomach pains and sometimes stole clothes, stamps and cigarettes. Since the murder of French Fifi, the police had sought a man resembling his description who had a history of violence against women or prostitutes. Only Norman had no such convictions. In fact, his only violent offence, before he was charged with murder, was the assault of a policeman while drunk. Which begs the question, after almost 2 years of hunting for this very unlikely suspect, with 3 murders having gone unsolved, and no other suspects for a 4th, as they had done with Stanley King and James Allen Hall, had a baffled police force simply bagged themselves a very convenient scapegoat? And was Norman Stephenson an innocent man? Having vanished, it would take 17 months for the police to find Norman Stephenson. By which time, memories had faded, recollections were hazy, dates had shifted, and faces were lost. His alibi for the day of the murder was not to deny knowing Marie, but to deny that he was even there. On Monday the 16th of August 1937, at 7:45 a.m, Norman Stephenson was released from Wandsworth Prison in South London, having served 3 months hard labour for stealing 12 shillings from a gas meter. Dressed in a shabby brown suit, but no hat, with a few coins in his pocket, he boarded the tram to Westminster. At 9 a.m, he said he ate breakfast at the Salvation Army Hostel on Great Peter Street, only there was no record of his visit. At 12 p.m, as Marie entered the Adam and Eve pub, he said he paid a visit to a friend near Waterloo Bridge, only this man wasn't in. Later, he said he ate lunch in a hostel on Middlesex Street, but again, his details were not recorded there or at any of the neighbouring hostels. At roughly 1 p.m, he said he caught a train from Waterloo to Merston, 2 hours and 19 miles south of Marie's flat. At 2:30 p.m, around the time that it is said that he entered the pub, his sister said she gave him 5 shillings, but I can't recall the date. And with so long having already passed, although the police had his fingerprints on a Guinness bottle as brought by the victim, marked with the pub's details, dated the day of her death, which was bagged and carried to the flat, and was later found open and drank beside her bed where her body was found. They couldn't disprove that Norman wasn't elsewhere. Just as they couldn't prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had strangled Marie. On the 29th of October 1937, even with an overwhelming wealth of evidence, and only one possible suspect in Marie's murder, being unaware that Norman Stephenson even existed, the inquest was concluded by the coroner, who would state, "There is no doubt at all that the police have made all possible inquiries. It is clearly a case of murder, and there is only one verdict which fits these facts." That night, a foul mood enveloped the detectives, as they knew they'd done everything right. When the public pinned the blame on society's outsiders, and when a feverish press had bastardized the facts to concoct silly stories about a monster they had dubbed the Soho Strangler, the police had stayed steadfast in their belief that each victim was murdered by a man with a history of violence against women. But having investigated every possible suspect, they had failed to find him. Only they weren't wrong. Marie's murderer had a history of strangling sex workers. It was just that, until now, he had never been caught. "16 months after the inquest, 300 miles north in Durham, on the evening of Friday the 27th of January 1939, 56-year-old Catherine Maud Chamberlain left the home she shared with her husband at Douglas Terrace, walking past St James's Park and heading to Castle Leazes Moor. It is uncertain why she was there. Some say she was meeting a pal, whereas others suggest that being the wife of a poorly paid labourer, she was earning a few extra shillings by selling sex to the soldiers stationed at the nearby Fenham Barracks. With the snow falling thick and the night bitterly cold, Catherine wore a long woolen scarf to keep the chill from her neck, and a set of rubber wellies as her feet churned the grass into a brown slushy mud. At 10:10 p.m, Catherine was seen chatting with a small man at the main gates of Leazes Park by Mabel Jackson. She described the man as about 5'3", aged about 25, dark hair, ruddy complexion, round face, dressed in a dirty dark suit with a collar and a tie, but no hat. Later arrested, Norman Stephenson would make a confession with chilling similarities. He would state, "I realised there was £2 missing from my waistcoat pocket," a crime he would blame on Catherine, having been dipped in the past, by which a prostitute will either overcharge a punter or will discreetly steal their money. Although we have no evidence to prove his assertion of theft. Feeling aggrieved, "I let her have one blow on the chin," he would state. but only being a little guy, although she went down against the wall on her knees. As she started to struggle, he rained down repeated blows on her face, as this terrified woman began to scream for her life. It was then that he strangled her to death. Norman would confess, "I grabbed her by the throat, but being too weak to choke the life out of her, I then got hold of her scarf." Not being the kind of man who planned to murder a prostitute, as she screamed, I tied a knot in it. A granny knot, which he knew how to tie in haste, being a labourer. "I had no intention of killing her," he would state. "I did it to frighten her and to get my money back." Which was almost certainly a lie, as in the same way the French Fifi hid her money in her left stocking, Catherine hid hers in her wellies, which he removed. At 10:15 p.m, a passing couple heard several screams by the ARP trench. But by the time they had raced to the barracks wall, Catherine was dead, and her killer had fled. With almost every piece of evidence eviscerated by the winter sludge, the Durham police were at a loss as to who this man was. Placing a description of the man in the papers, the press reported the facts in a factual and an unsensational way. But with only one prostitute dead, this little story would be quickly forgotten. As the Met Police had done, Durham Police had requested that all divisions across the country compile a list of men matching that description who had a history of assaulting prostitutes, especially strangulation. It was too eerie to be a coincidence, as the man last seen with French Marie was from Newcastle. With the press accurately reporting this suspect's description in all the local papers, Norman Stephenson had become spooked. Mid-afternoon, on Friday the 3rd of February 1939, just 1 week after Catherine's murder, Norman had tried to strangle another prostitute while drunk on Newgate Street in the heart of Newcastle city centre. In a local pub, having met Annie Cunningham Thompson, a local sex worker who he knew and liked, they headed into an alley for sex. Only nothing happened, as he was too drunk. Moments later, he put his hands around my neck and tried to strangle me, Annie would state. Which may have been his real motivation, as with this little boy desperate to be seen as a man. Were these assaults because he couldn't get an erection? Fighting him off, Norman fled as two men came to Annie's aid. But as he ran into Westmoreland Street, being racked with anxiety, Catherine's killer gave himself up. Walking up to PC John Patterson, Norman said, "I want to give myself up for murdering Mrs. Chamberlain. Since the murder, people have said queer things about my appearance, and it has got on my nerves." Detained at Arthur's Hill Police Station, he was charged with assault and with murder. On Thursday the 2nd and Friday the 3rd of March 1939, at Durham Assizes, Norman Stephenson was tried for the murder of Catherine Maud Chamberlain. Pleading not guilty, his defence was, "I thought she had only fainted. I didn't mean to kill her," and claiming self-defence for a knife which was never found. "I thought she had a razor. I was in fear for my life." But with no prior history of violence, the charge was reduced to manslaughter, as the court knew they hadn't the evidence to prove any premeditation. Having retired for 45 minutes, a jury of 8 men and 4 women found him guilty of manslaughter and allegedly flicking a little grin as he walked from the dock. He was sentenced to 10 years in Parkhurst Prison. Throughout the trial, Chief Inspector Drew had absorbed every detail about Norman Stephenson. But if he was so sure that this man had murdered French Marie, why did he convict a man called Robert Dixon? With Norman sticking to his shaky alibi, he would state, "I know nothing about it. I don't know the Adam and Eve pub, and I don't know the woman." On the 2nd of May 1939, Robert Dixon was tried at the Old Bailey. As with so much coverage in the press of the murder of Catherine Chamberlain, both the prosecution and the defence felt it prudent to try Norman under an alias. Pleading not guilty to murdering Lottie Astley, alias French Marie, he would state, "We were both drunk. She told me to leave and she pushed me. I pushed her back and she fell. I grabbed her scarf and I think it must have tightened." Only no one could recall her wearing a scarf, as it was summer. Having retired for 1.5 hours, during which time the jury had sought rulings by the judge on various points of law, they returned with a verdict of not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. With Norman Stephenson, alias Robert Dixon, sentenced to 16 years for the manslaughter of Lottie Astley and 10 years for the manslaughter of Catherine Maud Chamberlain, escaping a death sentence, he should have served at least 26 years in prison. But with both convictions set to run concurrently, he served just half. Released from Dartmoor Prison in 1955, Norman Stephenson died in 1969, professing his innocence. Almost 140 years after his killing spree, it is unknown if Jack the Ripper was ever caught. No one knows his name, or even if he even existed. As with so many theories and conspiracies, concocted by a feverish press and a public only interested in what's sensational. The facts are lost in a quagmire of lies and suspicion. More than 85 years after the Soho Strangler killings, the same could be said. As was he a man, a myth, or a monster? Since the start, the police would state, some of the newspapers have suggested that these cases of strangulation of prostitutes in 1995 and 96 are connected. We have convinced them that they are wrong. But did they think that? Or with only circumstantial evidence of a Soho serial killer? Was it quicker and legally safer to conclude one murderer solved, rather than 4 they could never prove were connected? We know he strangled 2 women to death, Catherine Maud Chamberlain and Lottie Asterley, as well as assaulting Annie Cunningham Thompson. But with no history of violence against prostitutes, he was never suspected of any earlier murders, as his first conviction for strangulation wasn't until 1939, 3 years after the murder of French Fifi. Although we have no sightings of the man who murdered French Fifi or Marie Cotton, the suspect last seen with Dutch Lair is almost identical to Norman Stephenson. Fresh complexion, clean shaven, brown brushback hair, a long black coat and no hat. As a small, unassuming boy who looked sickly and weak, was he often mistaken for harmless? Being so friendly, he would chat to strangers in a pub. The kind of punter a prostitute would wave at across a bar, and who she would invite back to her flat for a meal and sex, because she trusted him. He may not have had prior convictions for violence or sexual assault, but he regularly visited prostitutes. His earliest crimes were for acting suspiciously, and he was charged twice for stealing women's clothing. Was that entirely innocent, or does it hint at something deviant? Prior to their deaths, 3 of the victims were assaulted by punters, who had claimed to have been cheated out of money. To the police, Norman would admit, "I have been dipped before by prostitutes in London." He also knew Soho and the West End red light districts. He could tie a variety of knots at speed. And with no money found at any of the crime scenes, he knew where at least 2 of the prostitutes had hid their earnings. In neither the press nor the police reports is Norman ever named as a suspect in any of the Soho murders. But by comparing his work history and his prison record, there are a series of startling similarities. Sentenced to 2 months at Pentonville Prison, Norman was released on the 4th of November 1935, the day that Josephine Martin, alias French Fifi, was murdered. Dressed in a shabby brown suit, with no home, no job, and no money, it's likely that prison life had left him desperate for sex. On the 16th of April and the 9th of May 1936, the days when Marie Cotton and Dutch Lair were murdered, being unemployed and keeping on friends' floors, we know that he was in the West End. But by June 1936, being convicted of shop breaking, for unknown reasons, he had fled back to Newcastle, where he felt safe. And having been sentenced to 3 months hard labour, released from Wandsworth Prison on the morning of the 16th of August 1937, with no money, no job and no lodging. He got drunk in a pub, and just hours later, he murdered a prostitute known as French Marie, over possibly a few shillings. It could really be as simple as that. There was no myth, no monster, and no conspiracy. He wasn't a crime boss, a sadistic gay, or even a sinister Jew. As often, the most obvious answer is usually the right one. That these women were murdered by a recently released convict who was broke and had a deadly desire for sex. So was Norman Stephenson Soho's serial strangler? Or maybe the Soho Strangler was just a myth? Christ, that took ages, although that was a longer episode. Oh, there you go, Pee-Pee Poppers. How was that, Pee-Pee Poppers? There you go. Oh, the final part. 8 years of research, never been told before, and it finally been pieced together and told for the first time. And take off your little hat, there we go. Oh, were you hoping that I'd come to the end and go, it's this man, like with the Blackout Ripper, it's this man and we know it's him and he's convicted? No. See, this is the problem. When people come up with bullshit and the press come up with bullshit and things like that, it's just, it can't be pinned down. The police get a lot of their information from the people. That's where they get their information from. People are out there. The police aren't made of magic. They can't just magic up all this evidence. It's kind of, they rely on the people to give them information so they can go and arrest the right people. But when the press are there and the press are concocting stories about a serial strangler, when the people read that, they absorb that, it creates a myth, and suddenly the facts are lost in, as mentioned, in a quagmire of lies and prejudice and suspicion. And that's the problem, is with this case, who knows? Maybe if the press had done their job properly, you can kind of see it with Norman Stephenson at the end. You could kind of see it how they didn't really care, and they didn't know anything about the Soho Strangler. They didn't care. They were just reporting on one sex worker who had been murdered. Therefore, they were relatively factual. But the second it became something interesting and exciting, and everyone was going, "Oh, it's a serial killer. Oh, it must be exciting." Suddenly, all the myths start, all these crazy stories, and that's when you lose fact. That's when you lose truth. Is when people start concocting stories because it sells newspapers. Oh, so there we go. So. It's never been pieced together before. No one has kind of... It's not in any newspapers. It's not in any of the police files. The police never at any point said, he's a Soho Strangler. But it was when I was going through the files, all these pieces just started coming together. So I thought, let's piece together everything that I know and put it out there and say, is that it? Is he the Soho Strangler? Or does the Soho Strangler even exist? We shall never know. Anyway, welcome to Extra Mile. Cool. Well, we'll be diving into more in Soho Strangler Week. There's going to be lots of this. Now that we're not doing the stories anymore, now we can focus on just information. So, and how am I celebrating the end of the Soho Strangler? By having a sore foot. I think I've ruined my left foot. I'm not quite like Daniel Day-Lewis, but I'm close. Oh, my foot really hurts today. Shall I do a cup of tea? I don't know, because it took me a lot longer to write this one, because this was really hard to piece everything together and get all the old pieces right. And now it's gone 5 o'clock. It might be too late for a cup of tea. I think I might just jack that. Jack that, Jackie body. I just wanted to say, thank you to Dom from the Soho Bites podcast. I just kicked the table then. That's not what Dom did. Thanks to Dom from the Soho Bites podcast for playing the barman. The first barman when Marie goes into the pub and he goes, I did, what are you having? Thank you to Dom. That was very kind of you. I played the other barman. Just wanted to say, Jenny Miller, who listens to the show, is done. She's done what she calls her own London Dark History project, and it's kind of a Google map of all the kind of interesting sites around London where there's loads of kind of murders and mysteries and things like that. I've put a link in the show notes, but you can go to londondarktourist.com. That's londondarktourist.com. Have a look. She's kind of building it as she goes along. So, good work. Keep up the good work. Go and have a look at that. Link in the show notes. Also, Vivian got in touch with me. Vivian Holland. Vivian's book, by the time this episode goes out, Vivian's book will be available. So that is a book called Convicting Britain's Most Ruthless Criminals by Vivian Holland. So I'll put a link in the show notes as well. I don't make any money out of this. I'm just being a nice guy. People said, can you put this advert? Actually, most of them I said I'll just do it anyway. But yes, so Convicting Britain's Most Ruthless Criminals by Vivian Holland. Link in the show notes, should be available by the time this episode goes out. And of course, londonsdarktourist.com. So there you go. A thank you to new Patreon supporters. So Adam James, thank you very much, Adam. Phyllis and Lenny B. So Adam James, Phyllis. My brain is tired today. I'm exhausted after this. Although, do you know how I'm going to celebrate? At the weekend when I finished editing, I've got some Nigerian Guinness. Not London Guinness, because it's a little bit wet and a little bit light. Not Irish Guinness, which is good, but it's not the old traditional recipe. I've got Nigerian Guinness, which is traditional. It's a fuck of a lot stronger as well. So I'll be treating PCAG. I will be treating myself to that at the weekend. Yeah, unless I think Eva's probably drank it. I think she drinks by osmosis. I think she just touches things, and if it's got alcohol, she sucks it out with her finger. Oh, Eva, I wish you'd say. Oh, no, I'm not going to go there. Don't go there, Michael. Also, a thank you, a mysterious listener from Denmark who very kindly sent me a very kind donation via the Murder Mile donate button. So thank you so much. That went on the Guinness and some cake as well, although I am on a diet. Right, let's do some quiz questions. We'll dive into some extra stuff. And then we'll do the answers to the quiz questions, and then I will go and make some tea, and then I will collapse out because I'm about to pop. I'm knackered, but that was good. That was my brain. It's a real weird weight is let off my head now, knowing that I've written the final episode of the Soho Strangler. Although I know I'll be coming back to him again. I know this. I know that like the Blackout Ripper, it never ends. I'm still researching the Blackout Ripper earlier crimes at the moment, and I have a sneaking suspicion that the Soho Strangler. Well, go on the internet and try and find something about the Soho Strangler. There's nothing out there. You can look on the news articles, like British Newspaper Archive and things like that. There's bits in there, but you've got to piece it all together. This has been a labour of love for 8 years because I've had to put pieces together, and then you can't go into the National Archives and go, "Excuse me, can I have the Soho Strangler file?" Because there's no such thing. If you listen to my Walk With Me episodes, which are only on Patreon, the listeners on there have listened to me rambling all the time about me going, "Oh fuck, there's another fucking murderer," and me literally going, "Right, I'm gonna have to find this file. I'm gonna have to," it all started. The more I dived into it, the more there was more information. And there is no page on there that says, Norman Stephenson is possibly the Soho Strangler, and these are the reasons why. This is literally me having to go through thousands of pages over years and find little details and then cross-reference them, and it's been a real pain. And it was only in literally the last couple of days that I made the correlation between him leaving prison. him leaving prison with no money and needing to find a prostitute. It's only in the last couple of days that because what I do is I write, and then when I'm in bed at night, after I finish my chores, after Eva said I finished my chores, I sit there, I go on a walk sometimes and I ponder stuff and I think about it. And it's when I'm mulling over the details that all these little connections come together. And suddenly I just went, holy shit, there's two on the day when he left prison. And he was in prison for a couple of months. He had no money, he had nowhere to live, he had no job. And because he regularly used prostitutes, like a lot of prostitutes. Imagine that. You use prostitutes 2 or 3 times a week and then suddenly you're in prison for 3 months. What are you going to do? So, yeah. So, interesting. So he could be the Soho Strangler, but he might not be. Anyway, let's dive into some quiz questions. Answers very shortly. Question number 1, everyone. I was so tired at the end of this. I struggled to do 10 questions, but I did do 10 questions whilst eating a cinnamon bun. Question number 1. What was Norman's middle name? Question number 2. At what police station was the ID parade held? Question number 3. What was Norman's favourite football team? Even if you don't know football, that will be an easy one to answer. Question number 4. What did Norman claim he was sacked from the hotel for doing? Question number 5. What prison was Norman released from on the day of Marie's murder? Question number 6. How much did Norman steal from the gas meter? Question number 7. What village in Surrey did Norman say he went to visit his sister? Question number 8. What was the alias his lawyer used when Norman was tried at the Old Bailey? That was, what alias did his lawyer give to Norman when he was tried at the Old Bailey? Not what alias did his lawyer have, because that wouldn't make any sense, would you? Excuse me, lawyer for the defence. What is your name? Philip Blockbuster. See, it wouldn't make any sense, would it? Question number 9. Which detective was in charge of the murder of French Fifi? French Marie. It makes no difference, really, because he was in charge of pretty much all of it. And question number 10. What kind of fish did Norman and Marie have for dinner? So let's dive into some extra stuff. Next week, don't forget, we got Soho Strangler week. So I'm going to put out little episodes. These will be, I'm not going to make them massive things. They're going to be like micro episodes. I'm going to aim for about 10-15 minutes, so they're bite size. I'm going to really focus on all the kind of really relevant details, just so you can kind of get a better idea. I think we're going to focus on the panic. Is definitely going to be one. We're going to deal with kind of other prostitute killings in and around the area and why we don't know much about those. You know, they were just interesting things. Some which will help. One I'm looking forward to doing is how the press manipulated the people in order to change their witness testimony. So we will. I think one we're going to do is Stanley King. He gave his statement. We'll read his statement in full, and then we'll read his statement after it had been in the press, and he gave his second statement. It's fascinating, and you can see how kind of things change. The ID parade. I'm not going to say where it was because that's one of the quiz questions. You see, I'm doing better at this now. It was held. What detail? Why am I making all this noise? Hang on. No, not the ID parade. I was going to dive into details about the murder scene itself. That's what I wanted to do. See how tired I am. My brain has gone. With the police report, it's kind of interesting. The police report dated the 9th of the 9th, 37 to the acting chief constable. It says, this is a case of murder which occurred in a room in a house on the Euston Road during the afternoon of the 16th of August. The victim being a woman aged about 50. At the start, they didn't know who she was because everyone... When you go back to the previous episode, she has all of these aliases and people didn't know who she was really, and that kind of made it difficult for the police because they had to pin down who she was exactly. And even to the point at her inquest, she's still known as Elsie Charlotte Tocken, which is not really her name. That was her married name. Elsie's not her name and Charlotte's not her name. we know it's Lottie Asterley was her original name, but that's what makes it difficult. The victim being a woman aged about 50 who worked for a living but was given to drinking bouts and occasional prostitution. She lived alone in the room. There is no doubt that the murderer was a chance pickup in a public house, close but not quite right, and the crime was committed at the end of a drunken orgy. It's fascinating. In some elements in the press, because the police used the word drunken orgy, even though most of the press were didn't give a shit about this case. There were a few saw the fact that it was a drunken orgy, inverted commas, and they were like all over this. So like, this is fantastic. We can start dispensing shit again. But it wasn't a drunken orgy. As you can see, it's they had 4 bottles of stout and then they had sex. Not exactly an orgy, is it? Not by Eva's standards. Eva, it'd be like 500 bowls of gin and me just lying in the corner, covered in steam, going, wondering if I'm dead or alive. But either way, I'm still happy. That sounded creepy. It was committed at the end of a drunken orgy, which went on between the two of them during the whole afternoon. We have many witnesses capable of identifying him, but up to the moment, he is unknown. So that was August, September. So yeah, they really, as you can see at the start, I really wanted to go into all the details about what they did to kind of find who had murdered her. Coot outside having the moment. As with all of the victims, they didn't. I know people always love to go, the police did a terrible job. They just don't care. But when you look at the amount of work they had to put in, like even with the boxers, they spoke to over 1,000 boxers. They did the same with the miners as well, because he said he was based in Wales and the northeast. They spoke to over 1,000 miners as well. There's a lot of they visited all of the lodging houses and hotels and places he may have worked, and kind of you can see the amount of manpower they're using just to find out who she is and who he might be. So, as mentioned, Dr. Alexander Baldy was the police surgeon. He turned up. It's not Dr. Charles Burney who turned up at the first 3. This is Alexander Baldy. There's 2 or 3 police surgeons working at the same time. It's just coincidence that Dr. Alexander Baldy, Dr. Charles Burney was the police surgeon on the first 2. But on, I think it was Dutch Layer, they had, I think, also on there was Dr. Wilson as well, who was the other police surgeon. So there's a few. It's just kind of coincidence that sometimes you just get the same one that turns up. Dr. Baldy turned up, and he also did a lot of work on the Blackout Ripper case as well. He stated that the woman had died within the last 2 hours, and he turned up at about it was 7:55. He turned up, so that puts her time of death. He would say between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock. I think afterwards he said because there was no appreciable rigor mortis, he put a time of death as near a kind of 5 o'clock, which makes sense because the fire coming through the room and the smoke was about 5:30. So, no disorder in the room at all. He said it was a very untidy room, and there was a large table covered in empty salmon and other tinned food, beer bottles, a glass, a cup, a newspaper and some books. But even though the room was messy, you can tell the difference between messy and disorderly. Same with I almost gave away his name then. The detective who was in charge of this, he said although the room was untidy, there was nothing to indicate that there had been a struggle. The dead woman was lying fully clothed, face up, legs apart, hanging over the side of the bed with her feet resting on the ground, feet on the floor, head on the pillow. So same position as Fifi and Dutch Layer. So a kind of at an is it an oblique angle? I guess it is. Her hat was lying next to her. There's no mention of stockings in there, which was fascinating. I went through it twice going, where's her stockings? Where was her stockings? But because it was summer, she may not have been wearing stockings in exactly the same way as even though Norman says that he strangled her with her scarf, her silk scarf. He actually said it was a green silk scarf. No one can recall her wearing a scarf. In fact, this is the annoying thing about this case. The police never They never go back and check with the witnesses and say, was she wearing a silk scarf? But there's just no mention of a scarf at all. There's also no mention of stockings. So I have deduced that she wasn't wearing stockings or a scarf. Oh, God, burpee. The police may have forgotten to put it down, but I think it's unlikely because they're pretty vociferous with all the details when they go through everything. Oh, come on, hiccups. What else? Bedclothes. So she was lying on the bed, on top of the bed, but she hadn't got into the bed. What else? There were abrasions to the left-hand side of the neck and an abrasion on the right-hand side. So that is the finger wounds of where he had strangled her. One of the victims later on, Annie, said he tried to strangle her with both hands, but all of the evidence and all of the murders prior seems to show that he strangled them both with one hand, 3 abrasions on the left-hand side of the neck and an abrasion on the right-hand side, which means left-handed. Annoyingly, we don't know whether he was left-handed or right-handed. That was something else that I checked through, and that's not in there as well. Personally, I would have double-checked that, especially being a left-hander, because less people in the country who are left-handed than right-handed. But there we go. It's not in the file. Not everything will be in the file, unfortunately, which is really annoying. When the police turned up, they found no weapon at all. They said, I failed to find anything in the nature of a ligature on either the body or on the bed. He found she was wearing what they would call a bust supporter, which was kind of a makeshift bra made out of tape and elastic attachments, lying on the centre of the table. There were other things that they thought may have been used to strangle her, but when the autopsy was done, it didn't match up. It looked like it was something relatively thin. They thought it was most likely to be a scarf or a stocking or something like that, something that had been tied. What had been burned in the sink? We don't know at all. Police said, I noticed that there was some charred remains of... part of it was a curtain, which was being supported by a spring wire around the washstand. So there was kind of... Around her washstand, she had a curtain with a wire on it, and this was kind of... Some prostitutes have this. This is kind of, not that I know. This is kind of, well, I've done a lot of research into this, so I do know a lot. They have kind of a modesty curtain. So either she or the man himself can have kind of a pre-sex wash, because obviously, especially in that era, a lot of prostitutes they like to check to make sure that the man doesn't have gonorrhea or syphilis or anything like that. So they'll have a bit of a pre-check kind of upsy and a downsy before they go into bed and have the old sexy. There you go. You're learning a lot today, aren't you? The woodwork around the washstand, together with some toothbrushes and the panelling, had been scorched, indicating there was a recent fire in the vicinity. The linoleum beneath the door was also burnt. There was something else in the sink that was burnt, but it was burnt to such an extent that they couldn't tell what it was. Her handbag was found lying on an armchair containing a few pieces of broken mirror, but no money or other articles. Interestingly, on the table there was a bowl containing 2 shillings and 6pence in silver and 6.5 pence in bronze, but that wasn't taken. Neither were 4 keys. 4 beer bottles, as mentioned, as well as a tumbler and a cup, a salmon tin, and some condensed milk. The general appearance of the table was that a meal had been consumed. They didn't seem to buy anything in the market, so it's most likely that she already had this in advance, except the 2 Guinnesses, obviously. But again, I find that interesting. Same as with French Fifi. If you go back to that episode, there's a lot that's packed into every episode, and it's going to take a lot of... If you want to, go back into the old ones, have a look, because there's lots in there. There's lots of different pieces that I've dotted around deliberately. So back in Fifi had made a pot of tea and some eggs for either herself or a man, or them both. The police couldn't determine when the eggs were made and when they'd been digested. It didn't look as if I remember correctly, they thought she'd either eaten a plum or some tomatoes for dinner. So there wasn't eggs in her system. So it's likely that she may have made a meal for a man. So
who was the man, and why would she do that? If she was a prostitute, why would she do that unless she really knew and liked this guy? Unless, same as with French Marie, liked him enough that she would pop on the music, have some beers with him, have a bit of a giggle, then go down, have sex, and maybe not ask for money in advance because she trusted him. You know, this seems to be the thing that made it fascinating for me, is kind of, they trust him enough. He's a nice guy. He comes across pleasant. He comes into a pub. He can chat to anyone. You know, he doesn't stand out as an evil guy. He's a little bit unassuming. They will invite him over for a meal. They're happy to walk down the street with him, holding his hand, accepting a kiss. So that's kind of interesting as well. But then something's happened. Something sparked him. Something that has never happened before, because they know him enough to trust him. So this is what makes it really interesting. What did happen? Do you know, if a prostitute doesn't like a man, she will not pick him up. She'll just go, no, I'm not interested. As you've seen with Dutch Leia and the Greek man, she didn't like him. She said no. But not here. They seem to like him. They seem to let him in. So there's a lot going on. Interesting, unlike the other murders as well. With French Marie as well, she sat down on the bed and she had to smoke with someone, and it wasn't her husband, and it wasn't Dorothy Neary, the neighbour who was in the next door flat, lodging. So we don't know who that was. But we know he smoked. We know that Norman Stephenson smoked and he drank. It'll probably never be solved, but that's why I wanted to piece this all together, because there's a lot to cover. There's a lot of really interesting things. He was definitely in the room. His fingerprints were there. Unlike all of the other locations, I think the likelihood is, I know we've tried to dispel the myth about there being a conspiracy, and, you know, the police were in on it and all that kind of bullshit. And they go, whoa, why wasn't there any fingerprints there? Don't forget, this is a high traffic room. Prostitute bringing in lots of different men throughout the night. Some of them have got maids who do cleaning. Don't forget, your fingerprints don't always leave. You touch something, it doesn't automatically leave a fingerprint. It depends on the oils on your hand. It depends on the surface itself. If the surface itself is dusty, you won't get a fingerprint on there because the dust can be removed. Whereas if it's something great like glass and you've got oily hands, perfect. You know, here you've got fingerprints on the Guinness bottles, on the clasp on the inside of a handbag, on the salmon tin, on the can opener. You know, these are all kind of, it's metal. Your oil is going to stay on there, but everything else, not a chance. Even with Red Max, there were fingerprints found at the scene of Red Max, but they were all on bottles. Same as with Marie Cotton, there was fingerprints found there, but they were the policeman's fingerprints. So that could be why there's no fingerprints found at the earlier scenes, because not because someone farted, but I've waffled a lot. Sorry, I've waffled a lot today. I really dived into this. This is I could talk for hours about this. I really could. So anyway, yes, no. Do you know what? I was just going to dive in quickly. I'm sorry, this is overrunning. The ID parade. This is what I thought was interesting. So, almost 2 years after the murder, they got back almost all of the people. They couldn't get back all of the witnesses. Like Ghulam, the Indian waiter, had gone back to India, so they couldn't get him. But they all these people they knew had nothing to do with it, but they were great eyewitnesses. So what they did was they pulled them in and they said, when was it? 14th of March 1939, between 3:25 p.m. and they finished at 4:50 p.m. 13 witnesses were asked to pick out Norman Stephenson, who was in the ID parade, and he placed himself. It has to be a minimum of 8 people, and he could turn up and he could place himself in whatever section he wanted, but he has to stay exactly there. And he placed himself 5th from the right in the lineup. So all of the witnesses turned up. Mr. Eva Schladover, who was the who lived at 306 Euston Road. My brain is really dying now. She misidentified him. She identified a man called Thomas Brown. Kaufman Schladover, her husband, who saw him leaving the flat, he identified a man called John Page. As did Gertrude, who was one of the ladies in the pub. She identified another guy called Thomas Brown. As mentioned, it was only Reuben Packroft and Sadie Gibber. She was remarried by that point. Reuben said in his ID parade that he was very definite that he'd picked out this man because he'd seen him several times before, as had Sadie. So that was pretty good. Sadie even said, no, this is the man. But unfortunately, Kathleen Ula, she picked out a man called John Shelton. George Bakewell, who was talking to him for about 20 minutes, couldn't identify him. Neither could Frederick Dobson. He spoke to him for 20 minutes, couldn't identify him either. So lots of people could not identify him, but they managed to find two who conclusively said, yes, this is definitely the man. And because enough of these eyewitness statements that they got the day of the murder and the day after the murder were identical, before people had even started talking to each other, the police knew that they were onto a winner. But obviously, trying to get people to remember a face from 2 years ago is almost impossible. So, yeah, I think that's that. Well, let's do the quiz questions, then I can go and have something to drink. Oh, I might have one of my Guinnesses tonight. Ooh. Okay, question number 1. What was Norman's middle name? It was a trick question. He didn't have one. Question number 2. At what police station was the ID parade held? It was at Albany Street Police Station, which is just to the side of Regent's Park, where the early Blackout Ripper potential murders happened. Question number 3. What was Norman's favourite football team? Why, aye, man. It was Newcastle. Newcastle, man. Question number 4. What did Norman claim he was sacked from the hotel for doing? Easy one. It was upsetting a milk churn. Question number 5. What prison was Norman released from on the day of Marie's murder? It was Wandsworth, where the Blackout Ripper was executed. Question number 6. How much did Norman steal from the gas meter? 12 shillings. Question number 7. What village in Surrey did Norman say he went to visit his sister? It was Merstham. Question number 8. What was the alias his lawyer used when Norman was tried at the Old Bailey? It was Robert Dixon. This caused me a lot of pain when I was researching this, and then through the research I found out that someone had been arrested and convicted for the murder of French Marie. And then I went searching to find out about Robert Dixon. I couldn't find any files to do with Robert Dixon. And I was like, what that? And it took ages until I finally worked out that they'd used an alias for him at the Old Bailey, which I thought was fascinating. But it makes sense because they didn't want the jury to go, oh, I read in the paper that he's a nasty piece of work. Question number 9. What detective was in charge of the murder of French Marie and others? DCI Drew. Question number 10. I think I gave this one away as a quiz question, but that's fine. You can have this one for free. Present from me. What kind of fish did Norman and Marie eat for dinner? It was salmon. So there you go, folks. That's the end of the Soho Strangler. I will be doing an omnibus edition, so if you want just all the episodes without the waffly bits at the end, and you could just focus on the case, that's there. And I'll do some of these micro episodes for the Soho Strangler week next week. It won't be scenes and sound effects and all that. We're just going to be focusing on facts. I'm going to boil it down to just the essentials. So if you want to help solve who the Soho Strangler was and bring justice to those lovely ladies who unfortunately tragedy befell them, and their cases have never been solved, then you can help do that. That's it, folks. That's me done. God, I've almost finished. Have yourself a good week, folks. Stay safe and be good. And thank you for supporting the show. Lots of love.